In this video, we'll create a C# Windows application that allows an end user to interact with the data in a SQL Server 2005 Express Edition database by binding that data to the user interface controls on our forms. So we'll briefly talk about data sets and the major classes of the system.data namespace, which is often referred to as ADO.NET. And we'll talk about how they work together to provide a friendly programming interface that you consume in your applications to make retrieving and modifying data very easy. Now, the star of this lesson are the visual tools, the windows and the various wizards that we'll see popping up that make integrating databases into your application really a breeze. So Microsoft has made it easy for those of us who are just getting started to create very rich database applications, but they also expose the underlying classes that support this functionality so that experts can tweak it to their heart's desire. Okay, so first of all, what is data binding? Well, data binding is a feature of your user interface controls that allow them to retrieve information from a data source, like a database, and display that information to the end user. Now, each control might work a little bit differently here. Some controls will only display one value, or rather one field of data from a database. Other controls, like the data grid view, can display multiple fields of entire rows, multiple rows of data within its grid. And some controls allow you to edit the fields of data, which will then automatically update the original data source with those updated values. It really depends on what you're trying to do. And so we're going to look at a couple of controls in this lesson, and we're going to look at more whenever we create our RSS Reader application at the end of the series of lessons. We'll look at some other popular ones as well. Now, in order for all this to work, there's a series of classes in the .NET Framework class library that support this operation. Now, obviously, those classes that are directly related to the user interface controls, like text boxes and list boxes, they're going to be involved. But additionally, there are a set of classes in the system.data namespace that are referred to as ADO.NET. Now, ADO stands for Active Data Objects, and the name has ties to some previous versions of a data access programmer's interface from Microsoft years ago. I don't want to get bogged down in the etymology of ADO, but let's discuss all the things that ADO.NET does for you in an application, at least at a high level. And then later on this lesson, I'll try to tie these concepts back to the concrete names of the classes, which will be created automatically for us as we drag and drop objects from the various windows onto our designer surface, and we're going to see how cool that is. Okay, so first of all, ADO.NET begins by managing the connection to the database regardless of the type of database or other data source that you want to connect to. Now, a connection includes the process of locating the database, either using a file system or a network protocol, and it begins the handshaking to speak with the database. And just so you understand the concept of a connection, as long as a connection is open, your application can then speak to the database. Next, ADO.NET manages both the requests your application makes to retrieve the data from the database, and then it also manages the response from the database to return the requested data, or return a message that you asked for something that the database just can't deliver back to you. Next, ADO.NET then has a series of classes that manage the set of data that's returned back from the database query, so that you can write code to evaluate each field of data if you want to, or navigate through the data row by row if you want to, whatever you want to do. And then finally, at least for our purposes, there's a class that, for the sake of data binding the data to a user interface control, that this class will manage which row of data has been retrieved and set it to the current row. So if you have 10 rows of data your application returned from the database, all the user interface controls on your form need to know that they all need to be looking at the current row, for example, row 3. Now, if each control just looks at whichever row of data that they please to get their field of information, you've got problems. Each control on a form, in essence, needs to get on the same page, so to speak, so that all are looking at the respective fields that they need to display that belong to the same row of data. So there's a class that manages that current row of data and tells the controls on the form that a new row of data is now the current row, and so you should update your values based on that. Now, as usual, I've greatly oversimplified this, but hopefully you can see and begin to appreciate at a high level that ADO.NET is doing quite a bit for you automatically. You don't really have to know the specifics of how it works under the hood in order to get some benefit from it. Just know that there's a lot going on to support you in the building of database applications. Next, you might be asking yourself, why build applications that provide access to a database? After all, in the previous lesson, I demonstrated how easy it was to just open up the database and add or remove rows right from there. So why not just let your end user have access to that instead of going through all the work of building this face on top of a database? Well, actually, that's a great question, and there's several reasons why you would want to do this. First of all, in order to really get a lot out of a database, there's a certain level of aptitude that the user has to possess in order to interact effectively with the data in the database. And when you create a friendly user interface, you're hopefully going to reduce the learning curve for the end user so that they can do their job without having to worry about this weird error message that came back, or having to worry about referential integrity, or having to worry about some complex query that is necessary to pull data from several different tables, and we didn't really talk about that yet. But there's actually a lot of functionality that you can encapsulate and make easier by virtue of the fact that you're building an application that resides on top of a database. So you may not want to give them access to it just to simplify their lives. And then secondly, perhaps there's data in the database that you want secure, so you want to ensure that only certain users or certain computers can access that data, or perhaps you want to log who is making what changes to what fields and so on, and that's why you need to kind of control it through the use of a user interface to have more programmatic control over who is doing what to the data. Or thirdly, in the case of a website, you may want to display data in a database like a product catalog for your company's goods. Now, in that case, you wouldn't simply just put the database directly on the internet. First of all, it's not very visual, and you wouldn't have the high impact that you want. But instead, you'd provide some web page template that can access the database and display the information in a templatized format to the end user. And then finally, in most cases, you don't want the users to directly access the database because, and there's really no easy way to say this nicely, but because they might screw it up. Your job is to make sure the data in the database is correct, that it's relevant, that it's properly formatted, and so on. And it would seem at times that your users are going to find every way possible to thwart your attempts to do this. So to restrict their access to the underlying data by making applications that do checks on the entry, on the changing of the information, can maintain the integrity of the data, making sure that it is correct, that it's well formed, that they haven't deleted things that they shouldn't have deleted, and so on. And honestly, there's probably a dozen other reasons why you'd want to create a user interface on top of a database instead of allowing the end user to access the database directly. And hopefully these are going to suffice for now. And let's get started with building an example or two. Hopefully it'll become more obvious as we move forward. Okay, I've taken the liberty to create a new project called Lesson 09. Using the steps from the previous video, you can see I added a .mdf file, a new database file called My Company. And within that My Company database file, I added a single table called Customer. And you can see in the main area where I have the definition for the customer table, I have three fields: a customer ID, which is the key to that table, which is of type integer, and I'll scroll down here in the properties area, and you can see that it is indeed an identity column. Okay. The next field is first name of type nvarchar, with the size of 50, and then finally last name nvarchar with the size of 50, which is the default as well. Okay, so what I would suggest at this point is if you're following along and you need to catch up, just pause the video right now and try to duplicate this table structure in your project. Okay, I'm going to assume that you did that. I'm also going to show you now that, as we go to Show Table Data, I populated this table with 4 rows of information. I just made up these names for fictitious customers, and you may want to do the same as well by pausing the video and filling in some names at this point. Okay, I assume you're ready to go on, so I'm just going to close all these down in the main area. The first thing that I need to do is create a data source. So I'm going to go to my Data menu option and select Add New Data Source. This will bring up the Data Source Configuration Wizard. From here, you can see Database is selected by default, but there will also be additional types of data sources that we can choose from. Now we're going to ignore these for the time being, but this Data Source Configuration Wizard will allow you to connect to web services and to also objects that contain data. And again, we won't talk about this, but there's a lot of flexibility here. Let's select the Next button. The next thing we're asked to do is choose a data connection. Now, by virtue of the fact that we created a database file in our project already has knowledge of this database. As we saw from our Database Explorer, there's already a connection that we were able to work from in that window on the left-hand side that's slightly covered up by our configuration wizard. So I'm not going to create a new connection since it could find the database that I want to work with already by default. There's also the ability to select other databases that are known by our project, or create a new connection to an external database that's not associated at this point with our project. Now you can also do something neat and just look at the connection string, which is just some information that ADO.NET needs to know about the connection object of ADO.NET in order to find and handshake with the database. We don't need to really play around with that, it's just read-only. So I'm going to select the Next button. Now it asks, how should we save the connection string? I'm just going to suggest that you select the Next button here. Basically, that connection string we saw in the previous step of the wizard has to be saved someplace, and you can save it into a fairly updatable location into what's called an application configuration file. This is just an XML file that contains settings for your application. Now, we won't take the time in this video to talk about that at length, but in the other videos at www.learnvisualstudio.net talks at length about application configuration files. Let's select the Next button. At this point, it's taking a look through the database to try to find the various objects that are available. You can see here that I can drill down and find our customer database, which is what we want to do. Now, what's going to come out of this is a data set definition, which is in an XSD file. We'll talk about that in just a moment. It asks for the data set name. We're going to leave it at the default and then select the Finish button. And we're going to see what is created as a result of this. So once the wizard completed, you can see that a single file was added to our application called mycompany.dataset.xsd. The .xsd file extension indicates that this file is an XML schema document. Think of this sort of document as the table definition for our local copy of the database. Now, there's a distinction to be made. The actual data will be saved in our .mdf file. However, as our application is running, we're going to copy some of that data for our temporary usage here into a data set that will be used within our application. And this .xsd file defines the structure of that data set that will be used internally. Once we have added records to our data set, deleted records from the data set, and updated records in the data set, then those changes will be resolved back into the original data source, mycompany.mdf, through the use of some special ADO.NET components. And you're going to see how this works as we go through this example. So just bear with me if that didn't make sense in first blush, because it's actually very neat how it works, and there's some great advantages to working with data in this way. Now, Visual C# 2005 Express Edition also allows us to take a look at this document in a very visual way, because it's actually represented through a lot of weird characters that we could open up in Notepad, for example, and take a look at. But we're not going to waste the time to do that. We'll just look at the friendly representation that the IDE presents for us. You can see here that we have our an element called customer, and it has some child elements called customer ID, first name, and last name. Now that mimics what we have in our database, as you can see through our Database Explorer on the left-hand side, where we have a customer table with 3 fields, customer ID, first name, and last name. Now, why are these exact duplicates? Well, once we retrieve information from the mycompany.mdf into our local copy called a data set, the structure needs to be similar so that the data has some logical place to reside. First name should go with the first name field, last name should go with the last name, and so on. Now, once we have this data set over here, we can make changes to it and everything, and it doesn't impact our original data source, the mycompany.mdf file. This is a little bit advanced. Let's not worry about that just for the moment. I just wanted you to see what an XSD file looked like, and we'll talk about XML files at length in the next video. So the next thing that we want to do is open up the form1.cs that was created automatically for us whenever we created lesson 09. And what I want to do also is go to the data menu and select show data sources. Now that opens up a new window over here that's by default docked to the left hand side of my IDE, and you can see that we can switch through the tabs through the toolbox and the Database Explorer. And what we have here is another representation of customer ID, first name, and last name. And this comes from the My Company dataset. So you can see here we have our element of customer and then our child elements of customer ID, first name, last name. Now there's a little drop down on this customer, and when we pop it down to take a look at it, notice that it has data grid view, details, and none. What is this doing? Well, it allows us to define the default way that this set of elements can be represented on a form whenever we use data binding. So what I can do is make sure that this is set to data grid view, and then I'm going to drag it from the data sources and drop it onto our form, and notice everything that's done for us automatically by Visual C# 2005 Express Edition. First of all, it creates this neat toolbar. It creates this grid for us, and then there's several controls. Let's move this over a little bit. Several controls in the designer tray. We'll talk about what all these are in just a moment. But right now we have a complete working application, so I'm going to select the Run button, and we're going to see what this application can do. Now, notice that all I had to do is drag and drop, and I get the functionality of a complete application where I can scroll through and look at information in a grid that's from my database. I can use these toolbar elements to navigate through, just like I did in the previous lesson whenever we were working with the database. I can go to the first record, I can go to the last record, I can select this button to add a new row and type in new stuff. I can select this to delete items from the database, and I can also then, once I've made all these changes, select this Save button, and again it takes it from our local copy of the data that we're currently working with, and it will propagate any changes that we made, additions, updates, or deletions from the data set, back into the original data source, the mycompany.mdf database. So hopefully you can see the power of this data sources window. Now there was another option as well here, which is a detail view. Let's just do that for fun. I'm going to delete everything one by one just by selecting it and then using the delete key on my keyboard to remove it. Then I'm going to set this to details and drag and drop this onto our design surface. And now I get a different representation visually of the data. I'm going to run the application again. And notice now that I get a form, instead of a grid view, a form view, where again I can go to the last record, the first record, I can create a new item, I can delete it, I can save the data back into the original data set. So there's just two representations of the exact same data. The other benefit is that I still have the ability to go in and add things to my application. I can create new items on my form. I can do some validation. I can make some items read-only, like the customer ID field, for example. I may not want to allow the user to enter anything in there, so I still have full programmability of my form. It's just that the Visual C# 2005 Express Edition data binding features allows me to get to this point very quickly without having to write any code, without having to really worry about all the objects that I need. So it gives me a lot of power without having to worry about the underlying way that this all works. But for our purposes, we want to understand a little bit more about the items that were added to our form. Now, in both cases, whether we used the details view or the grid view, notice that there were items that were added both to the form and then also to our designer tray. Let's go through each one of those one by one. Now, the first item is an object called MyDataSet. We've already talked about what a dataset is. It is the container, the local container for the data that we want to work with within our application. So as soon as our form opens, what happens is that that dataset gets populated with data from a database. Now, how does that happen? The way that that happens is through the use of the next object on our designer tray, which is the customer table adapter. This table adapter knows how to retrieve data from the database. It contains a connection to the database, so it contains an object within the table adapter that knows how to connect to our mycompany.mdf, how to retrieve information out, and then also has the ability to resolve that information back into the database. So if we were to delete a record, it has its information within itself that knows how to work with the customer table so that one row of data could be deleted and updated and added and so on. Okay. The next object is the customer binding source. The customer binding source is that object that keeps track. It's kind of a bridge between the information in the data set and the current row that's being displayed on the form. So it coordinates with all of the text boxes in this case to decide what row of data currently contained in our data set, our temporary storage container, what row should we currently be displaying on all fields that want to display information about the current row. So, for example, we're not having one text box look at row 3 and the other text box looking at row 4 and delivering erroneous information. The purpose of the customer binding source is to keep all the controls on the form bound to the same row of data and to update and give messages to those text boxes and say, hey, the user indicated that they wanted to go to the next row or the previous row or the first or last, and so make your changes accordingly. Okay, and then finally we have this object here called the Customer Binding Navigator. That is this toolbar that we see at the very top of our form, which allows us to go to the first, the previous, the next, and so on. And all of these controls are available to us through the use of the toolbox. So let's see if we can find that here. Yeah, here we have in this data section of our toolbox a data set. You can see our data grid view, which we used just a moment ago, the binding source, the binding navigator, and also if we peeked around a little bit more, I'm sure we could find the table adapter and so on. But we could have manually added all of those components, all those controls onto our form and manually configured them, named them correctly. As you can see here, they've all been named with the word customer prefixed to the type of object they are, like customer, binding source, and so on. But the data source window did that for us automatically. Now there's one other player in this, and that is there's properties in each control on the form that allow us to bind to a specific field within the data set. And so if we scroll down and take a look at, for example, the text property, let me get on the right control here. Here we go. In the text property of this text box, notice that there is a little database icon. And if I hover my mouse cursor over it, you can see that it is bound to the customer binding source, specifically the customer ID field. Okay, If we scroll down a little bit more here, let me see, there should be another section. Here we go. This is the data section of the properties window for our text box, and we can open up this data bindings rolled up area and take a look at this text property. And if I were to use the down arrow on this little combo box, it opens up this visual window that allows me to select a given binding source and then a specific field within that binding source. Again, this information is coming from the schema document originally that we created in our project, and then the binding source knows how to talk with the data set and relate that back to, in this case, the text box control, that it should be bound to the customer ID. Now, if we were to go on to first name and then open that up, you can see that first name is selected from the list there, and so on. Okay, so all you need to know at this point is that by using these the data source window and dragging and dropping, we can set that automatically. But let's talk about how to set some of these things manually by creating another form within our application. And we'll accept the default name of form2.cs. And this time what I want to do is manually add all the things that I need onto this form. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a list box, and then I'm going to add 2 text boxes. And I want to add a label so we remember what this actually is. Move everything down here. Okay, and we'll add a button here as well. And while I'm thinking about it, let's just do this real quick. I'm going to go back to Form 1. I'm going to put a button on here, because we're going to need to know this whenever we're creating our RSS reader example, and that's how to open one form from another form. So we know that forms are just classes, so how would you create a new instance of the Form2 class? You would do something like this. Form2, and we'll just call it anything. In this case, F equals new Form2. And then we're going to look at this instance of our form. We've created an instance, but we haven't told it to do anything. So I happen to know that an instance of a form has a show method, and that should probably be what we need there. So let's just test this out real quick. Going to click button 1, and notice that Form 2 pops open. Very cool. Okay, so now let's get back into Form 2. Okay, so I know I need several components in order to hook this up to the database. Now, how do I do that? Well, fortunately, if I were to go over here to my toolbox, you can see that there are some what are called strongly typed versions of some components available for us. So in this case, there's a customer table adapter and a My Company dataset. Now, these again are just strongly typed versions of these components. I could come down here to this data section and drag and drop a dataset and drag and drop and find the table adapter and so on. But these are already pre-configured for our use because they're already associated with other items within our application. So in my case, I'm just going to drag and drop this onto the designer surface. And then I'm also going to drag and drop the My Company dataset instance onto my design surface. Okay. And so let's see if that's all we need to do. Let's run our application and click our button 1. But notice that nothing happens, that we don't see anything in our list box or in our text boxes. So we obviously haven't done enough. Let's go back and work through this example a little bit more. Let's go back to Form 1 and let's take a look in the Form 1 designer and see if there was anything added for us by the IDE, and in fact there are some things that were added for us. You can see here that we have some redundant code, and I think this is just because of the way that we added and removed items from our form. There's 3 copies of the exact same piece of information here, but ultimately you can see that we are calling customer table adapter.fill, and then we're passing in the myCompanyDataset.customer. So we're going to need to do essentially the exact same thing. Now, we haven't talked about the this keyword. This keyword refers to the parent object. So we talked about how a form is a class and you create an instance of a form. The word this refers to the current instance of the current object. So in this case, this customer table adapter as opposed to the customer table adapter that belongs to another instance of the current object, the current form. So let's not get bogged down in that too much. Let's move on to here and create a similar line of code. Whenever the form first opens up, we're going to need to add a line that looks like this. Customer table adapter 1.fill, and then we can just pass in myCompanyDataset.one, or we can specify that we want to work specifically with the customer table. Okay, so what does this fill method do of our table adapter? The fill method is what takes action to grab the data from the database and then populate the customer table of the data set with the data it retrieved. So that's what the fill method does. The other thing that we need to do is at this point we haven't told the list box that it should be data bound to the data set. So I'm going to use this little task arrow that pops open, and I'm going to select use data bound items. It's going to allow me to select the data source. What I want to do is select from form 2 list instances myCompanyDataset1. Then I get to select the display member, and I want to use for that the last name. And then the value member, I want to select the customer ID. So what's the difference between the display member and the value member? The display member is what actually is viewable within the list box. But each item within a list box has an underlying value associated with it. So it could be one and the same. We could have last name populated here as well, but because 2 people could have the last name of Smith, it might be better to use the customer ID, which is always unique, as you recall from our discussion on using unique keys within our database. Now that's all we're going to use for that. So let's save this and then run our application and see if this now works. Again, we're going to click button 1, and now notice that we have our 4 names listed because we have filled the data set with data, and we have told the list box to bind to our data set, specifically the customer table within the data set, and more specifically the last name field of the customer table. Let's go ahead and close that and move on. So the next step that we want to take is to bind up the text box controls on the right-hand side so that when an item is selected from the list on the left, that we can see the first name and the last name in the text boxes on the right. Now, there's 2 ways that we can go about this. If we just need read-only functionality where we're just allowing somebody to read the values, we can do this fairly easily by selecting the item, then going to the Properties window, finding the data binding section for the text box, going down to that text property of the data binding section, and then clicking the down arrow in the combo box. This will allow us to select the data source and the data element that will be used to populate that text box. We'll use Form 2 lists instances so that we can look at our instance of the myCompany dataset. As you can see, it's called myCompanyDataset1. That is this reference, this object here that's been dragged to our designer surface, and we'll expand that. You see, we can see the customer element and the child element's first name. We want to use that here, and then we'll do the same thing here. We'll do this a little bit faster this time. We'll just drill down to get the last name associated with this text box. Okay, so let's run this real quick and just to show you that this will work. And the reason this will work is that it does support some of the same functionality that the binding source object will support in terms of keeping track of navigation and things of that nature. But in order to get the most out of our application, so you can see here as we select each item in the list box, the corresponding item here on the right-hand side will be displayed. But to get the most out of the list box, so if we were to make a change to, say, Chuck Rivetto and change this to Charles, we want this saved back into the original data set. And in order to really make this work with the fewest number of lines of code necessary, we're going to add a binding source in order to manage that process. So what we'll do, first of all, is go down to the data section of our toolbox and select the binding source object. You can see here in the description that it encapsulates the data source for a form and provides navigation, filtering, sorting, and updating capability. So there's a lot of neat things that you can do. You can navigate through the record set just using code by using a method called next or previous or first or last. You can also filter through the data set to only return those items that, for example, have a certain last name that you're looking for. So you can build in some search functionality. But what we're going to use it for is for its ability to give us some updating capabilities, so we don't have to write a lot of code in order to save the changes from the form back to the original data source. So you see I added the data source object to the designer tray. I'm going to select it and I'm going to set some properties, specifically the data source, which I'm going to set to project data sources, my company dataset. And then I'm going to select a data member. There's only one here available to us, which is the customer table, or the customer element. Okay, and then the next thing that we need to do is take our list box and our two text boxes and bind them to the binding source. So we're going to remove the bindings that we have directly to the data set and move those bindings to the new data source object that we created. So we can think of this as kind of an interim object that manages the relationship between the controls on the form and the underlying data set. So the first thing we'll do here is select our list box, go to data source, and you can see here the binding source 1 is now available. So we're going to select that. And we're going to need to change the display member and the value member. So we want to display the last name rather, and then for the value member we want to change that to the customer ID. Great. Okay, and we'll do the same with the text boxes. Let's find that here in our data binding section. So we're going to go up to our new binding source object and drill down, and we're going to find the first name to replace the binding to the data set, and we'll do the same replacement by going to the last name text box, navigating through the binding source and finding the last name. All right, let's save this example now and then run the application just to make sure that the binding still works, so that we can select from the list on the left and see the results on the right, and it still seems to work. Excellent. The next step that we want to take is to modify the example in order to be able to make a change to the data. Like, for example, we'll use this, Charles, and then we want to click our button and be able to save that back into the database. So let's go ahead and stop this. And now I'm going to double click the button. And we're going to take this in 2 or 3 steps. The first step is that we have to tell the binding source that we're finished editing. And whenever we do that, what it will do is any changes that we make while bound to the binding source, it will save those changes to the data set. And then what we need to do is take the changes that were made to the data set and save them back into the original data source, the database. Now, so the first object we're going to use is the binding source. So binding source 1 dot end edit. Okay, so that will take any changes that were made while we bound to the binding source, and it will save them back to its underlying source, which is our data set. Now we're going to take the the data set and save that back to the database. Now, what is the object that we've been using up to this point that knows how to communicate with the database? Do you remember what that is? It's the table adapter. So our specific instance of the table adapter is customer table adapter 1.update. And we're going to have to pass something in. Now you can see that this is overloaded, so we can choose from just one data row to an array of data rows to the entire data set to just a single table within that data set. So just for fun, we're just going to pass in this last overload. So we'll do my company dataset 1 dot customer. Okay. Whoops. Dot customer. Great. Okay. Now, once this update method performs, it will return back to us the number of items that were updated. So what we can do is create int result equals 0. And we don't have to capture this, but I think it's a good idea so that we can view how many rows were affected back into the original database. And then we'll just do this message box dot show, and then we'll do result dot toString. So we get some feedback from the application that the save should have worked. Let's save this and then run the application. Click our button 1, and everything still seems to work. Now we're going to change Chuck to Charles, and then we're going to click button 1. You can see we get one row was modified back in the database. That's what our little result variable was able to capture for us. So now we should be able to shut this down and then open it back up, select Rivetto, and we can see Charles is now saved into the database. So this seems to work just fine. So I hope now you can see the power of data binding. We were able to create pretty full-featured applications, writing applications that sit on top of or expose information from the database to the end user by just dragging and dropping some things into place and getting a lot of functionality without having to write virtually any code, and then also being able to dive in and make some modifications to how the data binding works, setting some things manually so that we can customize the functionality to our heart's desire, and also allow us to update any changes that were made in the data back to the underlying data source, the database, where the data is permanently stored. In the process, we were able to talk about data sets. We're able to talk about the function of a table adapter. It has knowledge of a database, knows how to speak with and handshake with the database. We talked about the binding source and what it helps us to accomplish, and also talked about the XSD, and we're going to talk about XML files we know in the next lesson. So we covered quite a bit of ground and are now able to create some pretty full-featured applications featuring data that we can display to our end users. So I hope you enjoyed this lesson. This is some of the neatest functionality within Visual C# 2005 Express Edition because it does so much for you without you having to do a lot in terms of writing code. Now, if you enjoyed this video, please visit www.learnvisualstudio.net to download and watch over 400 videos just like this one, aimed at all skill levels on many different topics related to C#, Visual Basic.net, ASP.NET, and more. Thank you.